Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Cassandra Etienne, Assistant Director at the Center for Cooperative Media. Thank you for joining us for today's panel about housing inequality and how it's persisted in the state, impacting many New Jersey communities, in particular low-income communities and people of color. From soaring rent to eviction rates and redlining and other roadblocks to home ownership. This conversation will discuss the contributing factors to the state's housing crisis and what relief or potential solutions may be available to New Jerseyans. We're joined today by our host, Ande Richards, managing producer of the Diversity of Voices Project from NJ Advanced Media, and our special invited guest, who you'll meet momentarily. This event is part of the Not Your Same Old Sources series, featuring experts on our diverse sources database, which is a publicly available sortable list of experts with different races, genders, ethnicities, and ages. This is part of an effort to basically get journalists to expand their Rolodex and their reporting to engage and include the voices of different experts that better reflect the diversity of New Jersey. This panel is presented by the Center for Cooperative Media in partnership with NJ.com, New Jersey Ethnic and Community Media, and our event sponsor, the Office of Communications at Princeton University. Once again, thanks to you all for joining us. I'll just turn it over to Joe Amditis, who will provide some additional announcements.
Thank you, Cassandra. I appreciate it. So for folks who are unfamiliar, I just want to go over some basic tech stuff. We will be doing open Q&A at the end of this. So, but in the meantime, you can post your questions or comments or whatever you want in the chat there. Just make sure that it's addressed to everyone. There's a little blue bubble there. And once you send one DM, it tends to stay on that one. So we want to make sure everybody is sending it to the group that they want. You could just click that and choose everyone in meeting from the dropdown. If you run into any issues or tech problems throughout the meeting, you can go ahead and send me a DM in the chat, and I'll try to work with you behind the scenes to get it fixed. We'll also be posting links and relevant resources and information in the chat, so keep an eye on that. If you post a question in the chat and one of our panelists or hosts is not able to immediately address it, once we've circled back to the Q&A session, we'll make sure to scroll back up and posit that to our panel here today. I believe that's just about it. So with that, I will turn it over to our gracious host, Ande Richards. Ande, go ahead and take it away, and I'm going to spotlight our other panelists here as well.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. So welcome to Not Your Same Old Sources, panel discussion about affordable housing and, unfortunately, the housing crisis in the Garden State. My name is Ande Richards, and I am the managing producer, Diversity of Voices at New Jersey Advanced Media, NJ.com. And I'm really happy to be here today to be a part of this important discussion with our esteemed panelists. I wanted to introduce today's discussion with something I used in a newsletter a while back. Famed psychologist Abraham Maslow created a hierarchy of the 7 basic needs that all humans require for survival and ultimately happiness. And they are air, of course, water, food, clothing, sleep, which I need more of, safety, and the last one is shelter. Think about that. That's one of our 7 basic human needs. For some New Jerseyans, the last one on that list is a pipe dream or tenuous at best. Several New Jersey counties are at the top of the vulnerable housing list. So we have a lot to talk about. Our guests today bring with them a wealth of knowledge about how the crisis is affecting our communities and how we may solve or at least lessen the negative impacts of this crisis. Juan Pablo Garnham is the audience and community engagement editor at Princeton University's Eviction Lab. And Abdul Rehman Khan is the assistant clinical professor at the Center for Social Justice at Seton Hall. Welcome, Juan and Abdul.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
All right, guys, let's get into it. Abdul, I'm going to start with you because I read something interesting in your bio, and I think it's a great way to start us off. First of all, tell us a little bit about your work at the Center for Social Justice And then I want you to elaborate on what an adequate standard of living means.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction and for everyone who's joining in this very, very critical work. I think the sort of first part that I want to focus on is the role of imagination. Let's take a step outside of how things currently look. What we have today is a deeply violent design structure built upon a legacy and tradition of American policies that have excluded Black communities and other communities through the history of this country. And so what we have today in Newark are 40,000 eviction filings occurring every single year pre-pandemic. What that means is you have families forced out of their communities as refugees in their own community, in their own state. And so the role of imagination allows us to say, what is deeply wrong with this picture? How do we create a new story that people can buy into? And what does that look like in a just society? And exactly like you started out with, housing is critical. And obviously we've known that to be true, but after COVID-19, this has become plainly obvious to anyone and everyone. You need a house to be safe. What does decent and safe quality housing look like? In the US, we typically look at this in a restrictive sense. Do you have shelter over your head? Are you protected from the elements? But what we aspire to is a much deeper and richer sense of what it means to have dignity. And that dignity refers in two ways. First, it's legal dignity. Do you feel safe that your landlord or someone else is not going to threaten your ability to be removed from your home? We've had several cases in New Jersey where you not only have illegal evictions or evictions targeting particularly vulnerable communities, for example, folks without documentation status in this country. Not only do you have the preying and sort of parasitic nature of certain folks to prey upon vulnerable individuals, to suggest sexual favors in exchange for rent, for economic and market trends that are so much bigger than any specific individual. But you're also looking at actual individuals who show up and threaten people out simply because of their presence. They'll make veiled threats to you. I've had veiled threats made to me in court, not just from attorneys, but from people. Veiled threats to your family. I mean, what we're dealing with is a striking situation, both from a macro perspective, but also day-to-day in court. You have people who are losing their dignity. So you have legal dignity, but then you also have what we really focus on, which is kind of conditions or habitable dignity. Is your home safe? Is it free from rats, from mold? We just picked up a case where you have a ceiling that collapses in. Thankfully, no one was underneath it. That ceiling is repaired. It collapses again, just right around the corner from the law school where we are right now. The floor in the kitchen is so shaky, no one in the family has entered for months. The mold is so severe that it's severely debilitating the development of children in their education, that developmental progress. And the rodents make it nearly impossible to store food in a safe manner. We had another case where near 95% of the unit had no electricity. And so you have all these wires coming out of the kitchen, posing a serious fire hazard. And so you have lots of individual cases. We bring in a picture of a rat in a crib. And does that story normalize this violence? or does it present a shock to the conscience such that people are willing to change? And my concern, and I'll sort of turn it back, my concern is that certain elements and pictures and stories normalize certain narratives, which end up reifying certain structures in society. So I wonder for folks on this call, and I'd love to learn more and hear different perspectives. How do we create a story that shocks the conscience in a way that is productive for us and doesn't reify the dehumanization of people in our community?
Wow, that was a really deep answer to my question. And, you know, I have to say, like, the scenarios you're presenting are not that far-fetched. I have had a ceiling come down in my kitchen before, and one of those little creatures fall out. So this is not some outer world thing. It's actually happened to me. So yeah, we do need to find ways to tell those stories and to have them impact people in a way that we collectively take action. Thank you so much, Abdul. Juan, I want you to tell us about your background on housing. You've reported from various places in the world, not just in the United States. So I'm very curious about that, and your work at the Eviction Lab. And then I want us to go into some of the causes and consequences of the affordable housing crisis, specifically the critical societal aspects of eviction.
Okay,
That's a lot.
it's a lot, and also it's very difficult to follow Abdul after that one. I'm gonna start talking a little bit about myself. So I'm a reporter. I've been doing this work for more than 15 years now. Recently transitioned into more the research world with the Eviction Lab. And I'm from Chile, so I can see like a lot of differences, a lot of similarities in terms of the housing challenges that we see both in Chile, in Latin America in general, and in the US. My most recent job before this, I was reporting in Texas, so I could see also like how things change state by state and city by city. I was the urban affairs reporter for the Texas Tribune there, and I would have to write about the 5 or 6 biggest cities, which present very, very different and similar scenarios in a way, you know, with a very progressive city like Austin, but with an incredibly challenging situation in terms of housing affordability, and then with a city without zoning like Houston is, with a huge metropolis like the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplexes and so on. And I was gonna say one of the things that Abdul mentioned that the first like recommendation for reporters that are in this call is that changed me the most was that during the pandemic, I had this silver lining of being able to jump into housing courts via Zoom or via YouTube constantly, right? Because that wasn't the case before. You would have to go to court. So suddenly I was in San Antonio, suddenly I was in Austin, suddenly I was in Houston. And for me, that was like one of the most interesting and incredible learning experiences about what the eviction crisis looks in the US. So I don't know if you agree with me, Abdul, but I think a lot of times journalists are more centered in the moment of the eviction itself, the execution of the eviction. Like you see in TV, a lot of like journalists that go with the sheriffs and constables to the process, which is an incredibly dramatic and sad moment. We can talk that it's not very dignifying of the people that are suffering through that moment. But honestly, I think that our focus in terms of stories should be in courts, because a lot of stuff is happening there. And there you see like the inequalities, how unbalanced the system is, and of course like the incredible role that having legal assistance can have in the moment of being in court, which is something that it's not guaranteed everywhere in the United States, far from that. So about Eviction Lab, we are a research center we focus, one of our biggest strengths is data, and we have created these two large databases of evictions that didn't exist before in the country. We now, sometimes some people think like, hey, how come you don't have data from this state or my city? And it turns out until very recently, there was barely any data about evictions. So we have this national eviction map, which covers from 2000 to 2018 for every single county in all of the US. And I can talk a little bit about the numbers that we have for New Jersey later if you want. And then during the pandemic, we realized that the need was so much urgent that we needed data from yesterday, right? So very early on the pandemic, our researchers did this incredible effort to gather like data that's more online on real time. Sadly, not in New Jersey, because New Jersey has made it very difficult for us to get eviction data that it's reliable and that we can have in a weekly or monthly basis. So right now we have 31 cities and 7 states, and we're growing. But still we have big vacuums of data in places like New Jersey, in places like Washington State, Oregon, California, and a couple of other places like that. The last question, could you repeat the last question?
Yes, I wanted us to talk about the causes and consequences, and specifically the critical societal aspects of eviction.
Yeah, so I mean, we could talk for a while about the causes of our affordability crisis, of our housing crisis, but like summing it very briefly, I mean, there's like tons of books written about this, right? But summing it very briefly, I think we've had a big change that has made our housing crisis more dramatic after the subprime crisis, you know, and since then things haven't gotten better. We have an affordability crisis like all across the US. There's no state where you can find decent housing for what the minimum wage allows you to pay. This is in a certain way a global kind of phenomenon, but that it's especially marked in the United States. And of course the Northeast is that it's like the center or the epicenter of this crisis, alongside with some places in the West Coast. But in the last few years, this has expanded to be something that you can see in rural counties, in suburban counties, in big cities, in small cities, everywhere, right? And we could talk about why is this happening. You can say it from a supply point of view, you could say from an income point of view. Rents have increased to like in a way that income and salaries haven't. Yeah, and we could do like a full presentation only on that. In particular, the issue of evictions is really interesting, because what we and our founder Matthew Desmond, who wrote a book which I really recommend called Evicted, found is that eviction marks kind of like a very particular point in this process of your housing experience, which can mark you forever. And not only is caused by poverty, but it can also cause more poverty and has like a domino effect on so many more issues, including your long-term finances. You know, it creates a stain on your credit reports that might not allow you to have housing later on. It has educational impacts in the education of your kids. It has health impacts and all sorts of things. And actually in the eviction lab, what we've been doing recently is that with this data that we have collected, now we're finding all these connections with other things. So there's a lot more to come. But for example, very, very recently, we had a researcher that crossed this data with voting and participation. And we realized that when there are high levels of evictions, that really impacts voting and participation, which is a thing that now when we see it in the data, it kind of sounds a little bit obvious. I mean, if you're sadly displaced, first voting and like registering again, it's not your priority probably. And then some states make it very, very difficult to do that, right? So yeah, so we saw that in the first election that Trump won, we saw like a big effect of evictions in terms of voting participation, which was especially strong in places that make it more difficult for you to re-register or change your information, you know. So yeah, it's this incredibly impactful moment in someone's life, and during the pandemic, luckily in a way, it became more of a priority for policymakers. And what we hope is that with like this kind of return to normalcy, we don't return to normalcy, and we actually can keep talking about how we can avoid the very tragic consequences that we see on people that end up like losing their homes. So,
Thank you. Thank you. I want, no, that was good. I want to loop back to those consequences though, because they run deep. I mean, if you have an eviction, there have been times where I've been looking for an apartment and they're like, I'm not worried about your credit. Have you ever been evicted? And thankfully I can say no, but if I had been evicted, they wouldn't have rented to me. So, you know, it's on your credit report, which they use your credit report for everything, including employment now. You know, they're looking at your credit report to see if you're someone they want to employ. It's far reaching, so it's deep consequences. Abdul, people of color and those residing in low-income communities seem to be hit hardest when there is an economic downturn. So rents are going up, home prices are going up, and there are some practices that have led to people of color not being able to purchase a home, for example. I want to talk about redlining. I think you're the best person to talk about that. I don't know if the audience remembers, I don't know how old everyone is, but Lorraine Hansberry, her iconic play, A Raisin in the Sun, was about what we're talking about today, about housing and different things that play into it for a Black family. That play was written in the 1950s, yet some of these practices still exist today. So can you talk a little bit about what redlining is and how it affects communities of color?
Absolutely. I had a public policy professor in college who came from England and was originally from the Caribbean. And he said to our class that one of the biggest differences in housing that he sees coming from there to the US is that here you can live your whole life assuming that you're coming from a certain class background, and you never have to engage with poor people. Whereas he says that like everywhere else in the world, you know, if you live and come from certain backgrounds, it's nearly impossible to at least avoid seeing what poverty can look like. And so I think the sort of root value that we go for when we talk about redlining is how do we sanitize communities out of existence for certain dominant groups. So how do we keep people from opportunity in a state of subjugation, grasping for air and for any level of immunity against a medical bill or something else. The New Jersey Social Justice Institute releases a report for the wealth gap between Black and brown residents in New Jersey and white residents. And we're talking about, 0.01% of a comparison. Talking about, about $500 compared to over 6 figures in terms of average median wealth. So what that means is that When you're redlined, you're not only redlined out of housing opportunity, you're redlined out of economic opportunity, the ability to be in that sort of network where there's educational opportunity. You're redlined out of schools, and the funding that comes into play there. And you know, I think one of the critical questions that comes up here is that, you know, lots of areas in access to justice go to our market system and the way that things have been set up through our legal structures and precedent dating back 500 to 700 years. But there's really no area that speaks so closely to what property and capitalism look like, and what ownership really looks like, and the ability to have ownership over someone where one can simply file an eviction complaint in court and throw their life into a complete roller coaster. I think it also speaks to, you know, if you have such a low shield against, you know, an unexpected medical bill, you know, a $500, $150 medical bill. So many eviction cases are for small amounts of money, and obviously that term is relative. You know, what is small? But in an objective sense, of course, it's small. That level of shield is extremely low. So if you're dealing with an unexpected medical bill, if you're dealing with something that costs more than $500, then you really have to make that decision. And I think that is where, you know, the middle of the story is. That decision that folks have to make. Am I going to allocate these funds towards this or towards my rent? And more often than not, according to necessity, people will do what they need to do. In COVID, that means in many instances, folks facing illegal eviction, crowding up with other family members in spaces that are too crowded, and literally in frontline jobs, placing their lives at risk. And in most instances, these casualties come from Black and Brown communities who are frontline workers, who are clerks, who are nurses, and the question for who's actually quote unquote essential in society comes to the forefront. I also just want to make this, you know, and there's lots to really sort of speak about here, but I just want to build upon a really great point that Juan was pointing to. What does housing first look like? And I think in terms of our imagination, we can look to other jurisdictions around the world that have come up with a wide array of responses to what housing under global capitalism looks like. And part of it is increasing the supply of housing so that it satiates, it meets demand, and therefore you're able to keep that commodity or that competitive good at a rate that doesn't change so much. So you're not artificially increasing that amount because there's a decrease in the supply and such a significant increase in demand that there ends up being such a significant artificial increase in inflation of that price. But of course, in other jurisdictions, you know, and that's a model that we see in some parts in East Asia, and some models in Northern Europe, you see, you know, folks having such a tie to public housing where most of the community, most residents are living in public housing. And so in many ways, the question, you know, transcends politics with a lowercase p, in the sense that whatever jurisdiction we live in, regardless of what the sort of dominant legal narrative might be, so long as we say housing first, I think that we're able to create a culture where people people can at least have the dignity of having that shelter over their head and being protected from a baseless lawsuit. So I think that's part of the question as well. And I think oftentimes focusing on, what sort of structural change looks like, it becomes an impossible question because it's just larger than anything that we can really address. So what does housing first look like, regardless of whatever jurisdiction that we focus on? And then I'll turn it back, but I do really want to also speak about what the role of an attorney is in relation to a movement, in relation to the community, in relation to centralizing tenants, centralizing organizers, and what stories develop there. I think it's easy to create the narrative of the disenfranchised tenant who's powerless. I think we need to speak more about the fierce 75-year-old individual who is facing an eviction after residing in a unit for 30 plus years, and is going to town hall meetings, is going to her local government, is connecting with neighbors, is building up a tenant union, and is responding directly to the crisis that she is facing. And I think in creating that shift in what it means to be a powerful tenant, to build upon the movement that we see right now, we are able to shift a culture for what it means to say housing comes first.
Thank you. Thank you. Juan, at the very beginning, I mentioned that we have several counties on that most vulnerable list. We're in that top 3, I believe, New Jersey, California, and I forget what the other state was. And I know you said you had some statistics that you wanted to share with us about the state of the crisis in New Jersey. Would you share those with us now?
Yeah, I actually was just looking at what we know, and sadly, the first thing that I have to say is that we don't have very updated data in terms of evictions for New Jersey, as I was saying before, but we have managed to create estimates for every single county in the US only until 2018. So we have data from 2000 to 2018, and when we see there, when we compare New Jersey with other states, with peers, and not only with peers, but states farther out that with different realities, is that the numbers look really, really bad for New Jersey. So at a state level, the eviction rate for New Jersey is 12.1%. And then you think about places that are similar. So New York is 9%. California is way, way low, in spite of like all that we hear about affordability in California. It's 2.2%. Massachusetts is 3.5%. Pennsylvania is 7.1%. And actually, like the numbers of New Jersey look like states that we normally qualify as very landlord friendly, like the places in the South and in the Sun Belt. So like South Carolina, for example, which is like notoriously known as bad, is 23.3%. When you look into specific counties, it can look much worse. I know Abdul mentioned very recently some numbers from New York, and in Essex County, the number is astonishing. It's 22.6%. Of those, many times what we see is that landlords file several times against the same household. And what we know, and I actually shared a link there, is that this is what we call serial evictions, where they are trying to actually collect money through an eviction, which is it has a lot of negative consequences, and sometimes it's for very small amounts of money. But even we also have in our database like what we call the threshold, threatened household rate, which is actually unique eviction filings against a single household. And numbers, of course, go lower, but they don't go that much lower. I believe that in Essex County is around 15-16%. And in other places in New Jersey, it's not as bad as in Essex County, but it's pretty bad still. In Salem County, 16%. Camden the same amount, Cumberland County the same amount, Mercer County, which it's 15.2%. So the numbers are very bad in New Jersey, especially compared to other places surrounding the area. And this is 2018. What had happened since then? We had a pandemic, which what we know in general is that it was a historical moment. In a weird way, we have this silver lining where we had kind of like a makeshift safety net for housing for the first time, maybe in the US history, right? Because we had this moratorium, we had rental assistance, which was a historical amount of money. There's a lot of criticisms to what happened with rental assistance, but what is true is that we haven't had a moment like that where we have poured money like that into like helping tenants for a long time. And now we have inflation, which a big part of it is housing costs, and rent numbers that, although in the last month seem to be moderating a little bit, during the pandemic have increased incredibly. So according to Apartment List, in Jersey City, it was an increase of 18.7%, so almost 20% since March 2020. So during the pandemic.
I don't mean to cut you off, just on that last thing though, but salaries never seem to match the rates that the costs go up. So
and this is even worse for low income and low income tenants. So yeah, there are very good reports from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that I could just keep mentioning, but I really encourage you to go and look there at New Jersey. And we're talking about normality and what's normal and what's not normal. I think a great tool for reporters is actually checking what's happening with the neighbor. So looking at how the numbers are in other states surrounding the state. And even though we think that the Northeast is very unaffordable, actually we can see that the situation in New Jersey, it's pretty dire.
Yeah, and I've just moved here from California, so I have a really good understanding of what things cost. I mean, it's almost unbearable actually in Los Angeles.
And one thing that it's interesting is that in some places, I mean, California is still really unaffordable, but there's a movement towards a lot of like reforms, legal reforms in terms of protecting tenants a lot more, which has happened in some places in the Northeast too. But my impression is that we're actually seeing two very divergent paths, where in some places there is this movement and there are like bills that are passed to encourage, things like right to counsel, things like mediation, things like higher fees for landlords when they present an eviction filing, and a bunch of other things that we can do. And other places where tenants are either the same or even worse in some places in terms of the protections that they could have. So for example, in Tennessee, they made it illegal to create local moratoriums in case we have a future pandemic, right? Or a future crisis again, like the one that we had.
Well, and I don't need to cut you off again. We have 1 minute before we turn it over to the Q&A, and I'm a bad host because I forgot to talk about mortgages and the high rate of foreclosures that we have in the state of New Jersey, and specifically in certain counties. I mean, I don't even know what to say. I did an interview with Assemblywoman Brittany Timberlake, who co-authored I wrote it down, the Community Wealth Preservation Program with Assemblywoman Verlena Jackson. And that is all about how to help people who are facing foreclosure to be able to get their homes back, or to be able to get family members to help them get their homes back. And our governor, Phil Murphy, conditionally vetoed that bill. I don't know if either of you are familiar. It's A793 or S1427. Are either of you familiar with that legislation? Abdul, maybe you will probably.
Somewhat familiar, to the extent that we certainly need to create the trusts that are available for folks in being able to access homeownership and build that level of institutional wealth, generational wealth. And also a reminder for, these are minimal level playing fields that we should be aiming for. When it comes to home ownership, there were so many advantages that homeowners had during COVID for being able to tack on to the end of their payment plans any payments that they had missed during COVID-19. I think like 78% of people who had a mortgage qualified to do that. And yet those same benefits somehow didn't flow to renters, being able to, in the same, economic climate, not be able to sort of make up any missed rent without late fees or facing an eviction. So I'm not entirely familiar with the landscape of mortgages, but it speaks a very similar story to the one that we see with tenants.
Great. So I think now we want to open it up to our audience for questions. Joe, are you going to help us with that?
Absolutely. So yeah, if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You click that, it'll pop up and you click raise your hand. It'll look like that. Or if you want to post a question in the chat, we can read it out loud for you and our guests will respond. If we don't have any questions immediately, I know Cassandra and I have a few prepared that we would love to talk a little bit about, but now's the chance, folks. This is where you can get answers to your questions, quotes for your articles, all that stuff. We have Mr. Skoufalos here. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for the presentation. Thank you for the information. One of the questions I have is, what do you see the impact of the increasing number of properties owned by LLCs having on this? Because what we're seeing around here is a lot of these bank-owned or conglomerate-owned properties where people are just going to hold on to these things. And around where I am, there's a lot of, in Camden County, just outside of Philadelphia, so there's a lot of tear down, max rebuilds of historic homes. There's also a lot of people who are just willing to acquire property and figure out what to do with it later. And we saw this more in commercial lending interest, where all the strip malls kind of have these gaps in the smile, as it were, where they don't want to rent to people because they're happy to write down the losses against a larger portfolio. But now I think I saw some reporting from Asbury Park Press a little while ago about the increase the number of LLC owned residential properties. So I'm just curious if you guys have information or thoughts or perspectives on the impact of that on the what is already a housing shortage.
That's a great question, Matt. I'll just make a sort of I'll add a note here. JustFix.nyc in New York is doing an excellent job pairing two data sets in New York City. What they're doing is they're pairing publicly available data sets for folks who are paying property taxes. Those are readily available and usually trace back to an LLC. And then they're pairing data sets that speak stories about code enforcement issues in those same properties. And what they're able to do is, by matching those addresses in the code enforcement reports, typically tied to people who are responsible for making repairs, they're able to essentially pierce that corporate veil. So they're able to say, look, this individual is not keeping up with conditions in terms of their portfolio. And that's something that we're not seeing in New Jersey. And it speaks to, the value of accountability, particularly, when housing is such a priority. We see stories all the time of folks who are coming in under an LLC and trying to evict an entire building. And typically, most of these are illegal evictions. We see, the extrapolation of profits in a way that Juan had alluded to earlier, where you repeatedly evict and you collect and you save the security deposit. So every month you're evicting a family that moves in, pays the security deposit, and then you're not returning that security deposit because that business model is far more lucrative than waiting for that monthly rent check. We see that model coming into play. And entire neighborhoods are being raised in Essex County and across the state, from out of state LLCs, even out of country incorporated entities that are coming in. What is our response? I think at the very first level, we need that level of transparency and accountability. Who is responsible for creating and maintaining conditions that amount to what we call slum conditions? And in being able to do that, you allow a community, you allow a movement to have a specific target to say, this is who we focus our efforts and energies on. But I'll turn it over to Juan.
There's a lot. I think the question of ownership is one of the most important ones right now, and one of the most difficult ones to answer, right? Like, we struggle a lot, we don't know enough. But one thing that you will notice as a reporter, whenever you ask for a comment from landlord associations or apartment associations, is that they mention this idea of mom and pop, landlords being the most affected. What we've seen in eviction is that the top evictors tend to be concentrated in just a few names, and normally those are LLCs. We don't have data about that in New Jersey, but we see it in our eviction tracking system all across the country, where sometimes the top 100 buildings evict sometimes 15%, sometimes 20%, sometimes 30%, and sometimes 40% of all the evictions are made by just this small amount of buildings, which tend to be part of LLCs. That's one thing that I would say, but I think we need reporters also to help us with this, and our researchers are very happy to collaborate with reporters about all of these issues. The other thing that I was going to mention that I've seen anecdotally is the role of LLCs, and I don't know if this is happening in New Jersey, but I've seen it all across the country, the role of LLCs threatening one of the few affordable home ownership options that we still have in the US, which is mobile home parks, right? I do a lot of news monitoring, and you can see constantly evictions in mobile home parks from LLCs, because the owners of those trailers own the trailer, but they don't own the land, so they are still they can be evicted, and they had that chance of having some kind of home ownership. And they lose it because these LLCs are coming and buying the land to, a lot of times, to redevelop them or doing things like that. So yeah, I'm sorry that I can't give more answers about that, but I think there's tons of stories there. And I think since we still don't have enough research, I think the role of journalists there on kind of covering those gaps, it's a big one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions from attendees here? You can just, since we don't have a lot of people clamoring for it, just feel free to unmute.
I have a question, actually.
There you go.
Because we're talking about outside entities, buying buildings and land. How does that affect communities? We hear a lot about gentrification, and sometimes it's hard to define what that means, because we see people come in and we're like, oh, well, it actually looks nicer, like there's a supermarket here now. But then all of a sudden you realize that, half your neighbors are gone. So can you talk a little bit about how that affects a community, or how they even get to come in and purchase all of these properties in this land? Is it because of the foreclosures?
Can I make a question more about on the narrative side of things?
Okay.
I actually am very careful with the word gentrification. I think it has come like this easy buzzword that we can use, and that has lost its kind of power a little bit. And honestly, the issue here, or one of the biggest issues behind gentrification, is displacement and forced displacement, right? I think that our focus in terms of telling stories should be there. A lot of times, yeah, like gentrification can be such a complex issue. It can even mean for some people, that managed to be homeowners a long time ago, to cash in and, to acquire, and there are cases, I know better, like in New York, for example, where people were able to buy a long time ago, people of color, Latinos, black people, and they were able to cash in. I'm not saying that this is like the most common, of course, And then, yeah, as you were saying, you might have better amenities a lot of times, but the question then becomes, it's like, who is enjoying of those amenities, right? If a nicer park, if a new train station comes to my neighborhood, will that kind of create displacement, or will I be able to enjoy, and will that have an impact in my quality of life? So yeah, that's kind of, I'm just putting it out there. I don't think it's answering your question, but I think we should, as journalists, have like a more complex kind of look at that and put the emphasis on who's being affected and how like changes in a neighborhood affect people, you know? Yeah.
All right. Like I said in the chat, we have about 8 minutes left, so we do have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. If you would like to follow up with today's speakers or continue the conversation, do not worry. We will be sending out a follow-up email after this event with the recording, a auto transcript, and contact information for our panels today. I'll do one last call for any other questions, and then if not, I have one that I'd just like to throw to either of our guests today. Anyone? Bueller? Matt, you want to jump in? Yeah, go for it.
I'll ask another one if there's space. Can
Yep.
you speak a little bit about what the eviction process is in New Jersey? Because from what I understand, you know, New Jersey has more protections for tenants than some other states might. I don't know very much about what it is like, but I was given to understand that it's better than in some other places. It's difficult, but maybe I'm confusing that with the foreclosure process. So what are the grounds for eviction, and what is the process as somebody walks through it or is made to walk through it?
Absolutely. We have 18 grounds for eviction. So we have a bill that was passed called good cause eviction, which says that in order to remove residents from their home pursuant to an eviction, one has to have a good cause for it. In other words, it cannot just be the expiration of a lease. And so theoretically, assuming that the Anti-Eviction Act applies to the residential property, which in 99% of cases it does, that means that theoretically a tenant can live there in perpetuity. And so the process typically is that, you know, 85% of filings are non-payment filings, which does not require a notice. So the remainder 17 causes of action, which comprise the remainder 15% of eviction filings in the state, require at least 1 or 2 notices. So with non-payment, a landlord does not need to provide notice if you're short $5 on your rent, or there was a misunderstanding, or in many instances you send the payment by mail, it has not been received by the first, a landlord can file in court. And once they file in court, it becomes part of your record. And to Andy's point earlier, simply having that record with you, where we are working on bills right now to make those records not visible, not you know, as accessible as they are, to make sure that those records are confidential. But if you have that record, it becomes nearly impossible after a certain point, unless you're able to resolve that eviction filing in court. Typically, you know, at the quickest rate, you can, you know, look at, you know, a week and a half that you know, from filing into court until you have a special court officer. But typically it takes a few weeks, where you first go to court, then the court will issue a judgment of possession. After that, the landlord has to apply for a warrant of removal. And then after the warrant of removal, a special civil court officer can come to the premises to evict a family. And even still, there are added protections now where up to 3 business days after a family has been removed from their premises, they can still post that rent and regain access to the unit. But I think the bigger issue here is that despite having what some might describe as, you know, quote unquote, good laws or better laws than other states, the bigger issue here is that those protections are not enforced. So this is why lawyers are not part of the solution here in sort of or at least in leading the solution here. Even if you have a great legal response, you need people to know their rights and for those rights to be enforced. And so when 99% of tenants are showing up to court without a lawyer, that means almost 99% of them do not know about the Anti-Eviction Act and the 18 causes of eviction and the various notice requirements that each require. They're also not aware of the thousands of pages and court rules about how there are certain exceptions that apply in these various situations. Not only do you need and I know that I'll leave this point out just in the interest of time.
All righty. Thank you all so much. Unless Juan Pablo, did you want to respond at all?
I think Abdul explained it really well. We can talk about that forever. I shared a resource that is really helpful to compare eviction laws in different states, and you can see how things change. New Jersey has good costs, but actually the filing fees are super low compared to other pairs, which makes it easier for landlords to file. So you can see how all these different factors affect. And I would really recommend reporters to go one day, check a hearing without lawyers like Abdul, and then go with a lawyer like Abdul, and you'll see that it makes such a difference, And yeah, I think that's
I know we're out of time, but I'm hoping next time we can talk about tenants' rights organizations, because I have a friend who quit his job solely just to help people fight for their rights as tenants in a community in Los Angeles. So I think that's a really powerful way for people to advocate for themselves. Maybe something we should be talking more about, take a little bit of the power back to the people.
That's excellent.
That sounds like a great topic.
In the final minute, I just want to make a pitch for something that we're working on over here. So we're building out a legal design laboratory at our school. And what that means is that we are using concepts of design thinking to understand legal questions in housing justice. And the reason we're doing this is because typically you'll have a group of lawyers come together, ideate, come up with a resolution, a bill, without ever having consulted the community or tenants in creating that tool. And so how do we center the user? So we're building this model based upon other legal design labs around the country and around the world. In housing justice, we're specifically starting in the area of housing justice. And I think it's going to be a really exciting opportunity to develop solutions and prototypes that allow just intervention for folks who are facing displacement.
Yeah, I think one thing that people forget, but this is very basic. A lot of people don't know that they have the right to go to court during their when an eviction's coming. And this is something super basic, a very simple thing, and they just leave it. Sometimes for good reasons, they don't want a record stain, they don't want any trouble, they have many other things to worry about. Sometimes because they don't know their rights. So yeah, it's an incredibly complex situation, but sometimes even the most basic things are not something that tenants necessarily know. And the legal system is very complicated. So any kind of solution in the line that Abdul is mentioning, that sounds amazing. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much once again, and thank you, Abdul, for posting your email in the comments in the chat there. We will be sending out an email with all of this recording and auto-generated transcript, resources, links shared in the chat, all that stuff, contact info. So keep an eye out for that, and thank you so much. Thank you to Princeton for co-hosting, and thank you to Ande for being our wonderful moderator today. We will see you all next time at our next Not Your Same Old Sources event, and we appreciate your time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you all so much.